What is up, everyone? Welcome again, my Fiction Ink Flow Tribe, and I am here today with a interview from a world-renowned, best-selling, and award-winning author, Dennis Crosby, to talk about his new book, Death's Debt. Please welcome in Mr. Crosby, everybody.
What's going on, man? How you doing?
Oh, good. Welcome to the tribe. Thank you for giving us this interview.
Definitely, man. Happy to be here. Happy to be here.
All right. So your latest book, Death's Debt, has been doing really well. I've been looking for it everywhere. Unfortunately, I cannot get it in my local community without getting on Amazon or going to Barnes and Noble. And I think that's just a testament to your writing. One of my local bookshops I went to, who kind of they always have like little off the trail books and like little really nice things. And so I said, "Can I get the new Death's Debt by Dennis K. Crosby?" And he said, "Yes, we do have some copies in." Now, I scheduled this before Thanksgiving break. So I'll say, when I come back from out of town, I'll grab the book. I go in, "Oh, I'm sorry, we don't have any more copies available." So once again, that's a testament to you.
it's weird actually to hear that now, because writing was something that I enjoyed for a long time. Like, I was that kid in high school that used to love the essays. And
Yeah.
I loved English class and writing, and I thought about writing a book, but I was really lazy back then. So I never imagined I would get to this point. And now I'm at this point, and people are recognizing my name. Actually, a few months ago, we had a guy come in at my job for an interview, and like he knew me just from like the internet searches and stuff, and like he'd seen my
Wow.
book pop up. So it's really weird to hear that now. It's fun. It's just such a strange trajectory to take, but I'm loving every minute of it.
I'm so glad. So I kind of want to jump right in with our questions. The first one for you is like, how did you decide to become an author?
Yeah. So, well, this is weird too. So it was probably I was just finishing up my undergrad, and I was sitting around with a bunch of friends, and we were kind of talking about what we are going to do next. And at the time, I was working in retail. I was working at Home Depot. Which is a job. I mean, it's an easy job to do. You make a lot of money working at Home Depot, and it's pretty simple. And off the top of my head, I said, I'm going to write a book. And they're like, really? What? Why? What? And, I hadn't even thought about it before that moment. And I think from the moment I said that, my mind just started going and gravitating towards that. I've always loved telling stories.
Okay.
But just like I just mentioned, I thought I was just too lazy to do that long form. So I started writing poetry for a while. I did that for a number of years. And I did some short stories here and there, because that's pretty much where my attention span could take me. I could do
Yeah, I get that for sure.
Yeah, I could do 9-10 pages and not a problem. And it was probably about 10 years ago that I decided to really get serious about doing more long form stuff. So I started taking workshops and meeting up with different people in the writing community, and just getting more ideas about like how to do it. Like, what are these things? What are these elements that I need to really understand? So it's been a lifelong passion, but I didn't really start taking hold of it or grabbing hold of it probably until like the last decade or so.
Oh wow, that's pretty interesting because I know like I was always that. It's funny how you mentioned that kid who like to love to write all the time.
Yeah.
That was me with the reading. Like I was always getting the scholastic books and the magazines and trying to read all the different things, and that kind of got me into writing a little bit more too. But yeah, it definitely is a long process, and
yeah,
I toyed with the idea myself and just like, But I'm definitely happy to hear your success story.
It's been, like I said, it took a while to really kind of get to that. Once I realized that you get overwhelmed, right? You look at these books, like, I read a lot too, and I look at these books, I'm like, man, I can't imagine just sitting and writing all of that. Like, 80,000, 90,000 words.
Right.
And then you when you start writing, you realize that there's another process. So you can write the book, but you got to then edit, and you have to have people read it and test it out. And there's just so much to it. And once I realized that, I'm like, oh, I'm never going to write a book. But then eventually, once you just kind of take it chunk by chunk, and I really started, once I connected with the writing community, I was able to appreciate those steps a lot more, and really understand the nuances of the craft. Not the business of publishing so much, but the craft of writing. They're two very different things. And appreciating that craft, I think, is what really helped kind of propel me and get me to calm down and actually sit down and write something.
Yeah, but I can see that all the way because I know it can be like you said, overwhelming and like, oh,
Yeah,
there's so much out there already. And what can I do? What can I bring different to the table? So I
that's the
can
key.
just
Yep.
imagine that process already. Like, yeah, it seems just like really, it can be frustrating.
Absolutely. Because I would just what you said. Like I would think about all these ideas. Like one of my original ideas was I was going to have a vampire character. I was going to write the definitive vampire novel, mind you. Um, but my character's going to be a vampire, and he was going to be a private investigator. Private
Oh,
investigator
wow.
vampire part time. And then as I'm thinking about it, I'm like, okay, so I start like writing down notes, and then like 6 months later, the Buffy spinoff Angel comes on, and he's a vampire, a private investigator. Like, well, that idea is now gone, and I was too naive then to think about the fact that that wasn't original. There's
Yeah,
been plenty of that, and you have to realize sometimes that all those ideas, they've been out there, they've been done, but they haven't been done by you. And that's the key is
right.
the story is what it is. It's the characters that people fall in love with. So if you can
Yeah,
create
I
some
believe that
great
100%.
characters, you're good.
Yeah, because if you have weak characters, there's no interest there.
Exactly. Exactly.
All right, let's go into my next question. All right. And talking a little bit about your genre. So why did you decide to choose the urban fantasy genre as your genre of choice?
As a kid, I watched a lot of television. Period. Mostly, and I watched a lot of Star Trek. I watched and the cartoons. I watched like Thundercats and
Oh, yes. Yes.
old Spider-Man cartoon. Whatever comic book was out that they made a cartoon of, I was watching it. And so I've always loved that fantasy world. I grew up, reading comic books, Superman, X-Men, everything in DC and Marvel that made a lot of it just kind of brought me joy. It was just these fun
Yeah.
storylines. And I've always had this fascination with two things in particular: immortality and magic.
Mm.
Um, so I've always gravitated towards stories and movies, books that had those elements. They fascinate me. For me, it's like it's an escape from reality. It's
Yeah.
but not that far, because with urban fantasy, you've got mythology, you've got magic, you've got all of these potential sci-fi elements, but it's grounded in the real world. And so you're not stepping too far from what's really happening. But in that world, in that urban fantasy world, there's a whole different thing happening, and it brings a whole different type of hope, right?
Yeah.
So I wanted to create a world that kind of mirrored our own, but that looked at other things, looked at other possibilities. Maybe magic does exist. If it doesn't, thinking about it sometimes can bring that type of hope. So yeah, it was just you can do anything. You can create these worlds. You create these rules. You, anything is possible in that urban fantasy world. And it feels like it's like a comfort zone for me. So I've
Okay.
always kind of gravitated toward that.
Yeah. I'm pretty new to the urban fantasy genre myself, and my awakening was Lovecraft Country.
Yes,
So,
yes.
like, I saw the first episode on HBO, and
Hmm.
I immediately went out and bought the book.
Yeah.
I'm not watching anymore until I read this because I was so captivated in this whole thing of like, black people having magic, and it's been down for years and generations, and like we've done this for so long. And I was just,
Hmm.
it's like I was awakened again to something completely new. And so I just
Absolutely.
took a deep dive, and I was like, this is the greatest thing. And I like, why have I not discovered this genre before? So I'm really happy you're writing in this genre. That's why I kind of came up with that question.
I think the other beauty of urban fantasy is that it taps into other cultures too. And I'm a big fan of learning about other cultures. And there are so many cultures out there that are rich with lore. They've got these different beliefs, and they've had these different experiences that they've passed down from generation to generation. And it's interesting to learn about that and then kind of bring it into your own world too. My stories tap into a lot of Greek mythology, but there's
Mhm.
other types of mythology that'll be woven in as well. You know, later books will have some Egyptian mythology. There'll be some Japanese. Um, it's just there's so much out there, and you can learn about all these other cultures too, and what kind of where they've gone and how they've grown, um, just by doing the research and then kind of adding that to your own work.
Yeah, and that's kind of like the perfect segue to the next question, but also kind of like what I kind of once again did that deep dive, because then I went into American Gods. So
Yes.
I watched the show, and I like this was another one that kind of hit me, and I went and read the
Hmm.
book, and I was loving the blending of all the different culture and the gods and how they left their places of origin to become here in America, and just like
Exactly.
that whole idea of origin stories. And I even recall reading and watching some cartoons too, like you mentioned, Static Shock.
Yeah.
And one time he went to Africa, and there was like the African superheroes, and I was learning about Anansi the spider, and I was like, this is
Hmm.
just a wonderful world that I just didn't know exists.
Exactly. Exactly. That American Gods, a lot of the stuff that Neil Gaiman has written has kind of been an inspiration for me because I was never really into Norse mythology beyond
Mhm.
Marvel comics and reading about Thor and Odin and Loki. And he digs a little deeper into that, and he brings all these other gods into the mix as well in American Gods. So
Yes.
yeah, it's a fun world to experience. It's a fun atmosphere. So much is out there, and you can educate as well as entertain.
Yeah. And I think we kind of really answered the question, but I want to know if there was any more specific one. So the next question is, what comics helped to influence and inspire you in the process, or even early on?
Yeah, I mean, when I was a kid, I read the standard stuff, Superman, Batman, all the Justice League. I read a lot of the DC stuff. I read a lot of DC because that was my initials.
Oh, right. Yep. Yep. Makes sense.
I read a lot of DC also because it was real. The stories were just so fantastic. Like it was completely removed from reality. I shied away from Marvel early on because it mirrored so much of the real world. Like everything
Yeah.
that they did, it was kind of a metaphor for what was happening in real life.
100%.
And yeah, and I didn't appreciate that, I think, until like my late teens, early 20s. And then I started mixing and matching. So when it came to comic books, it was pretty much, all the biggies in the DC and Marvel world. Um, and when they started translating that stuff to animated features, I mean, I was all in. And now, I mean,
Yeah.
with what's happening now with the Marvel universe and with these cartoons, and I mean, it's like my childhood is coming back. I'm able to relive all of that.
Yeah. Like I said, this is the perfect time to be in if you are a comic fan, because the movies are
Oh
just
my
doing
God,
just
it's amazing.
amazing.
Yes.
Amazing, as well as its TV shows and the animated movies. It's like everything is
Hmm.
just like so realistic and so perfect now.
Exactly. Exactly. I'm glad I lived long enough to see the technology catch up with the stories.
Exactly, everything
So that
comes
they
to
can,
fruition.
yeah, exactly. It's stuff that I never read, Guardians of the Galaxy before, and before I saw the movie, and I'm like, wow, they actually brought that together. Now this really sounds interesting. I'm
Yeah,
gonna go back
I
and
had I had heard of them because I was kind of like you. I was almost the opposite. I started off with Marvel,
okay,
and because I found this connection to myself and to the real
yeah,
world, my big opener was X-Men, because it was like you said, a metaphor for racism, and I just
yep,
really was drawn to that book. And
absolutely,
Spider-Man, because I was like, I can relate to being in high school, kind of like the nerdy
yes,
guy,
yep,
So I was like, I can relate to the realism of that part of it and this fantasy of being a superhero. So I took that deep dive too, and DC came a little later because I felt
right,
DC was too perfect for me. They were like
yeah.
perfect gods almost. They didn't have that many flaws.
That was
So
the
I'll
thing,
open up to
yeah.
them later.
That was the thing that drew me to them early because they were so perfect. They didn't have the flaws.
Mhm.
And when I started to appreciate Marvel more, I moved away from DC until they started to change a little bit. They started looking at, maybe Superman's not this, grandiose character. He's probably got some issues. He's the only one of his
Yeah.
kind on a planet where he's got these abilities that no one else does. Let's tap into that. And once they started doing that, and kind of getting to that the human element of being a hero,
Hmm. Hmm.
that's when I started kind of coming back to them, and that's what I appreciate a lot more. And another thing that I try to do with my books is try to bring in that human element. My characters might have these fantastic powers, and that's great, but what's the other stuff that they're worried about? You know, what are the flaws? What is it that really
Right.
helps people relate to who they are?
Exactly. All right, which brings me to my next question. All right. Did you originally plan for your Death or Cassidy's novel to be a trilogy, or was it just like a one-off?
So we have this saying in the writing world where we write novels that are standalone novels with series potential.
Okay.
Um, so I I wrote the first one with the intent of having at the when I started it, it was going to be 3 books, yeah.
Mhm.
But I had to write the first one so that it could stand by its own case in case it didn't do well, and there would be no reason to write more. Um,
Right.
but at this point now, like the first one did really well. Second one just came out and it's getting good reviews. But I've got all these stories now, and I really love this character. So I think I'm moving away from the trilogy track and just I'm gonna write Cassidy until people tell me that they're tired of it. There's just so
Okay.
much out there for her. There's a lot for her to kind of get involved in. And the beauty of this is that I've woven in characters that will get spin-off of their own. You know, I've mentioned some
Perfect.
characters. A lot of the characters that are in the book are characters that I've written stories about in the past that I just didn't know what to do with. So I've been able to put them in this series, and they'll get their own books somewhere down the line. But it's a great world where I can just kind of incorporate a lot of different people and a lot of different storylines. So yeah, it was supposed to be a trilogy, um, but it's gonna just it'll go beyond that. As long as people want to read it, I'm gonna keep writing
I think that's a perfect plan for success.
it.
Yeah. And it's going to my one of my final questions for you is can you and you talked a little bit about this earlier, but can you share a little bit more about your creative process when you actually start to write?
Yeah.
I know one time I did talk to a writer. His name is Mark Miller. He wrote the original Marvel Civil War storyline
Hmm.
before it became, big and everything. And I talked to him, and he said, "I had this story since I was a teenager, like
Hmm.
about some like internal conflict." And I was like, wow, it's like it just took all this time to bring it to fruition. So I'm
Sure.
always curious about, people's favorite, stories or characters, or how long it took them to kind of come up with their ideas.
So my first novel, Death's Legacy, Cassie's first book, came out last November. That book actually started out. I was in school. I was working on a Master of Fine Arts degree because I wanted to learn more about the craft of writing. So I went and pursued an MFA. I was taking a screenwriting course.
Okay.
That book started out as a script, an
Oh.
awful script. Um, I give scriptwriters so much credit because you have to put an entire story. Like if your movie's 90 minutes, your script is 90 pages. You've got to
Yeah.
put all that story in that 90 pages, in addition to kind of directing how the scene flows and what's supposed to be in
Yes.
it. And it's such a complicated, for me, it was a complicated mess. Um, but I liked that story so much that I wanted to build out. And I decided to really focus on it. I ended up making that book, that screenwriting, or that screenplay, my thesis. That became the
Oh.
novel. Um, and so for me, I learned a lot about kind of drafting through that screenwriting class. So what I do is first I'll research. I will kind of decide, who my characters are going to be. I will take some notes and I'll assign them. I'll describe who they are, from what they look like to what their vices are, what
Okay.
their interests are, what their favorite foods are. I'll really kind of give a deep dive into that character. And then I outline it with 3x5 index cards. Each chapter gets a card.
Hmm.
And I
Okay.
kind of decide what that chapter is going to be, what kind of the overall summary in 2 or 3 sentences. And then I add in the emotional elements that I want to capture in that chapter.
Mhm.
So I do that for each chapter, and that way I can kind of pull them out, mix and match if I need to. Um, and then once that's done, once I've kind of got a good idea of where I'm going, I'll start writing. And I'll often deviate from the cards. Sometimes that happens, but at least I've got kind of an outline or a pathway to take. And if I get to a point where I'm stuck, like something just doesn't make sense anymore, I'll pull back. And one of the things I love doing is interviewing my characters. So just like we're having an
Oh,
interview now, I'll write out questions and I'll answer those questions as if I'm the character.
wow, I like that. I've never heard that part. That's really original. That's
Yeah.
really a good introspective way of getting into the mindset of your character.
Hmm.
I like that.
Absolutely. So, and then I'll take that interview and I'll get a better sense of who they are and kind of what their motivation is. And then I can go back to the story and start to weave in some of those elements. And that will sometimes kind of fix some plot holes that I have. It'll help kind of inform who that character is, which then, informs the storyline and sort of takes off from that point. And I'll be able to kind of keep going through, at least to get the first draft done. And then after that, it's a matter of rereading, making sure things kind of make sense. I'll share it with a couple beta readers and see what they think in terms of the content and the flow. If they've got ideas or suggestions, or they just tell me something doesn't make sense, then I can go back and make some adjustments and start to get that draft really finalized and set.
Okay. I'm definitely going to take what you said to heart because I'm an aspiring comic book writer myself,
Yes.
trying to get into the industry. And I know it's crazy, but I know there's so much now with independent publishing, like you kind of do your own thing. But I really love that idea about the note cards and as well as the interview. Like that, just like something hit when you said that, and I really think that'll be like a good way to kind of look into how to develop my stuff even further.
Yeah. I think I'd want to kind of I want to do a comic book or at least like a graphic novel as well. That in and of itself is another art that I have to kind of take because, it's very different than writing a book or writing a short story. That I admire those guys too, because it takes a lot of skill really to get that story and get that comic book script the right way. And then working with an artist to put all that stuff together. It's incredible.
I started thinking about the idea of actually like being serious to write a comic in like mid 2000s.
Okay.
And then got married, had a child. 11 years later, I did do my first. I wrote out the draft for like my first issue. And I've been stuck ever since. Like I got the first one. Like I'm not giving up on it. I'm gonna keep going.
It's tough sometimes, especially with us, we're working writers.
Right.
Writing is not what pays my bills. It's what else. It's the other thing that I do that I enjoy. But I've got that regular 9 to 5, and it's hard sometimes coming back after a full day of work and wanting to write. Like you have to force yourself. You got to sit and make that time and schedule it. So it can be hectic. I get that completely.
And I know we did talk about comics a little bit, but this is something I ask of anytime I'm able to have a guest on the channel.
Yeah.
I always ask, when did you fall in love with comic books?
Oh, man. Probably, at least, 5, 6 years old. I remember going to the stores, just like the little corner store, getting some candy, getting some soda or something. And I would see they had the little spinning rack.
Yes,
right by the door.
Yes.
And it was the artwork. The artwork is what catches you,
Yep.
I start looking at it, I'm like, ooh. And I got to a point where I was probably picking up maybe 2 or 3 comics a week for a while.
Okay.
And then as I started to learn and appreciate the storylines more, I certainly pick up more, and they would come out like on Tuesdays. So I'd be at the comic book shop, right after school on Tuesday, just going through what the new issues were, and couldn't wait for the next issue in the storyline. But yeah, it's so early on.
Okay, I know it's so funny because I would just recall in high school going and I would get like 2 books every month, and I would go and I would see people with stacks. I was like, wow, like you were buying all those books every month. I'm like, I'd never be that person. And storage unit later full of comics.
I had a friend in high school. He bought 3 comics of the same issue. So he'd buy 1 to read, and he'd buy 2 to keep. One of those he would definitely keep for himself. The other he'd probably try to sell.
Wow!
But every time he would buy 3 copies of an issue. Yeah.
I know, because you never know what's going to hit. Like, something like,
Exactly.
I got this book and like, oh, now it's a big major movie. Like, oh, I should have kept that.
Exactly.
So, Dennis, I want to thank you for your time and for granting us this interview on Fictioning Flow. And I want to put up there where you can find your book at DennisKCrosby.com. Please check out everything that he has written on Amazon as well as Barnes & Noble. Any last party words you want to leave for our guest?
No, I just thank you for having me, and I really appreciate. Like I said, I love having the opportunity to come and talk about writing, about pop culture, comic books, whatever. And for all those, one of the best pieces of advice I give to all those up and coming writers, people that are interested in trying to get in the field, find your community. Find those folks that are in that community, and it's not so much so that you can network, but it is that, but it's also really just absorbing what's out there. Writing is one of those kind of art forms that it can be it's very solitary. Like, you can really be by yourself, and no one understands what you're going to go through during that process like another writer. So connect with those communities that are out there, get to know them, get involved, go to meetings, and just enjoy the process.
All right. Thank you so much. Until next time, everybody. Peace.